In this video, what I'd like to do is show you how we can use fracture in a little bit different way. We've used it in layout where we just click the button, set how much we want it to break up, and press go, and the dynamics go to work. But sometimes you're going to want things to blow up or break up in a very specific pattern. And with fracture in Modeler, you can determine where the breakup happens from. For instance, a car drives into the side of a building, or you have a wrecking ball that hits and you want the building to fracture from that point. You can do that with the fracture tool in Modeler. So what I'm going to do is load up, I've already got it loaded, that is, this 2-flat. All right, and this is on your project folder. It's just a little building I put together. Simple box with some holes cut in for the windows. And in a blank layer, I've got my building mesh in a background layer. All we're going to do is take a ball, and we're going to just kind of hit it right from the side here. We'll pretend this is a wrecking ball. Okay, I'm going to press N for numeric, and I really only need about half of this dimension, something like that, because what the fracture tool will do in Modeler is determine, based on points or polygons, how this will hit and fracture the building. So if you come over here to multiply, and then you come down here to the fracture tool, let me reverse layers with the single quote key first. I'm going to press fracture, and here is much more control over your model and how it breaks up versus what you see in layout. We can create interior surface, of course, any randomization as we want of how things are created. We definitely want to preserve original, so that's checked on, and we want to create our object in a new object, a new project object, for instance, rather than a new layer. So it'll be an entirely different object, keeping our original nice and safe. Now, every once in a while, if you break something up and you want one of those pieces to get up and walk away, or you want that to dissolve, or you want one of those pieces to animate later, you're going to need to select parts to layers. But be very careful with this, because breaking things up based on these objects like this in the background can really create a huge amount of points and polygons, and all those pieces into other layers could really tax your system and be very daunting, really, to go through and select each one of those. So I would say keep that for very simple breakups rather than more complex ones, because fracture keeps all of these parts that it's going to break up into one object layer, which is much easier to work with. We want to explode parts, and I've set this to 250 because our grid space down here is 50 meters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to go to right about here, 250 meters. And a little randomization is good, maybe not that much. And if we morphed it, exploded would be the name of the morph. We're going to keep the original algorithm versus the matrix or halves, but you can experiment with those. But the trick to this fracture in Modeler is that we're using, instead of random points like in layout or layer points, we're going to use layer polygons. What layer? Well, the layer back here, that ball that I created. It's going to look at those polygons and break up the object from those polygons. Cell count 100, let's just do 20. Let's keep it simple. We'll click OK, and fracture goes to work. You can see it down here in the information panel. It says fracture, and in a moment you'll see the little blue bar come and give us a progress window. And what this will do in a moment is create a new object layer, a new object itself like this, and build that object into there, into its own layer. So there it is. Now it looks a little funky at first, but if you just kind of jump back to the original and go back to this one, you're going to see it all put together. But now look where that breakup is. The building's together, which is great, but over here, look, it's like there's a big crack right in the side. You can see it from up here too. And that's where the collision can happen from and where the object will break from, which is really cool. So let's save this, and we'll save it as 2-flat fracture. That. In another layer, we are going to zoom out, and in fact I won't even bother doing that. We'll go to this original one where I have a ground and the original ball, and we'll copy those, Command C or Control C on a PC, and paste them down. And then let's just take that ball, right click, select all those with the right bracket key, cut those, third layer, paste, and we'll press F7. And the first one is our building. Double click. This one is ground. We're just naming the layers here. And this one is ball. And that way when we get to layout, we know what's what. We can place some surfaces, and if we want, press Q. ball. There we go. Give this its own surface name, put some smoothing on, make it kind of shiny. Almost bronze-like, that's fine. And we'll save it again. So let's send this to layout. Take our light, and let's get that out of the way. You don't have to use a ball. You can use anything you want. I just chose to do that because it's very simple. For the light, I'm actually going to press Y and rotate, and let's get it kind of like that so you can see what's happening here. That's good. So I'll take this ball, and it's already in place. Let's create a key here at frame 30, because this is one good way to work. When you build things in place, it's good to keyframe backwards. So it's already in place. Let's create the keyframe where we want that to land, which is at frame 30. And then at 0, I'll move it over here, out of the way. So over 30 frames, boom. And at 30 is where the building is going to go to town. So for the building, I'm going to create a key at 30, just as an example. And we will make that building a parts body. And then we're going to make the ground, and I've just clicked on it to select it. You can see it down here. The ground is a static body. And just like we did earlier, the ball is a kinematic body. I'm going to open up the item properties. And for the parts, which is the building itself, the activation is going to be on last key, which is frame 30. We will save the scene as to flat, fracture, same as the object, and then press the play button. And now that big wrecking ball has trashed that building. Now I did very simple objects here just so that you can get it working and see it work, because the more you do to it, obviously the longer it's going to take to calculate and the slower it'll be. But what's really nice about what we did here is that we actually broke it from that space rather than just overall where we had done the example a couple of videos ago. So imagine a bullet hitting glass and breaking that up, a wrecking ball, anything like that. But you notice though it's kind of slow-mo, which actually is kind of cool really. But if you want this more real time, let's open up the item properties. And then what we're going to do is come in here to the world, and here's where the gravity is. Now gravity by default is negative 9.8 meters per second squared. So you're really not going to change that. What we do want to change maybe is the time scale. Let's say I times 10. We bump that up to 1,000. What happens if we do that? Let's give it a second to recalculate, and I'll rewind. Okay, so basically it just sped everything up. I'm going to change my frame down here to about 150 for my scene. Not that. Boom. Okay. So the parts still need a little weight to them, because the building probably wouldn't quite break up that fast, but that's how you can do that. Like, so for instance, you can go back to your domino scene and play with that time scale and have things fall a little faster if you like. So now if we click to the items tab, let's take a look at some of the other properties. When I hit the play button, they kind of float. They look okay, but we really wouldn't have a building flying up like that. So we have to do something about that. And we can change the time scale, but I still need a little more weight on there. So let's look at the properties for this building. It's set to a volume density, which is fine. We can play with given mass or area density, but I think the volume density is probably best. But the density itself, if I change this to 0, watch what happens. Building just gets nothing, sucks up the ball. Okay, if I change this to, let's say, 0.01, works a little bit better, but they still kind of float away like they're underwater. Well, let's take a look at the glue strength too. It's set to 10%. Let's bring it to 1%. What does that mean? Well, that means the building itself is going to stay a little bit more glued together. And then what you can always do is even try something in the other direction. Do 1,000. Now you can see some of these parts down here are actually working a little bit better. A little faster, a little more real time. Still getting the ones flying away though. So here we can change the braking distance maybe to 0. Let's rewind, hit the play button. And now the building's gravity It just breaks, and then the gravity starts to take a hold of it. So a little bit more realistic. Let's give it a few more frames so we can see what's happening there. And everything kind of slides. And this is where I would then come back to the world and increase our time a bit. Let's rewind again, let it recalculate. There we go. Hit the play button. And now things are kind of destructing and falling apart pretty well. All right, let's do one more thing now that we've played with a lot of those values. Let's go back to items. First I'm going to save the scene, and you can load this up. Then we'll come down here to dynamic objects, and let's add a particle emitter. We're going to make this a hypervoxel emitter. And what we need to do for this is actually have the particles come on at a certain point. So as this building falls down, we can actually have the particles emit and just put like a little puff of smoke. So let's leave this alone for the time being. Let's just play this out and see how our particles look. And what we'll do is we'll come down here to a wireframe so we can see them. Now the particle emitter by default is only about 1 meter in size, and we've got a 1 kilometer scene, which also is kind of throwing off the measurements when we're doing that. We need to keep that in mind. This world measurement also has a lot to do with how the dynamics are placed. But this 1 meter size, we need to get it to a little bit larger. So there's our particle emitter. Now I'm going to bring the Y value down to like 100 millimeters, because what we want is just particles coming out this way. Okay. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can actually just size up the emitter itself. You can play with the birth rate, and you can envelope that value, because we want the particles to look like they're kind of puffing out and growing. So what I'm going to do is press Shift H for scale, and I'm going to scale this down just like that at frame 0. Then as the building comes and hits and falls like that, right about here, as the building starts to collapse, we'll have the particles expand out. So let's go right to frame 60. So we'll create a keyframe at 60. Just hit return. And that means the particles will sit still for 2 seconds. And then as they come out, we're just going to slowly bring out this dust, maybe about 3 seconds or so. So we just size that out like that. Okay, so then we're going to come back here to our graph editor, something we did earlier, and this is for the emitter. For the scale, we're going to select all of those, select the first, hold the Shift key. Here it's drifting for these first 2 keyframes, so what we want to do is use your right mouse button and lasso select those keys and set a tension of 1. So it's going to hold, ease out, and then ease in. And then we are going to press the play button. It hits, and as they fall, the dust comes out. And that might be a little too fast, so it's easy to fix. Just take this keyframe. What I do is click on the top bar of the timeline to pop that up, move that over, and then actually let's start it a little sooner, kind of like this. Rewind, play again. There we go. And it still might be a little fast, but that's okay. Slide it over some more. All right, so I'm going to save this as a version, save incremental. Now let's just put some hypervoxels on here. So we'll go to VPR mode, and then we're going to go to Windows and choose hypervoxels. And down here is the emitter. Let's activate it. So now you can see there's blobs. We don't want that. We don't want the surface. We actually want sprite. And then we're going to increase the size of these sprites. Remember, we have a 1 kilometer grid. We got a very big building here. So we'll just increase these. And let's put a size variation on. And suddenly we get this nice little dusty smoke. If we go to shading, we can bring the luminosity back a little bit. And I haven't surfaced the ground or anything, so let's jump back over here to our surface editor. Here's the ground. Let's put a nice little procedural on there. Sort of a brown color, and then we'll hit texture. And the procedural texture for the ground, We could put a little noise on there, but let's see what else we got in here, such as crumple or bricks. Let's do Y and the automatic sizing. Now, automatic sizing is going to look at the entire set of polygons. So what we want to do is, now that we have that, it's just kind of bring this down. It's looking at 4 kilometers. We want this maybe more like 200 meters. And then 200 meters. Yeah, let's do 10 meters. Let this redraw, just so those are in proportion with the building. And there we have some bricks on there. So I have a nice little ground. And I think maybe instead of white, this grout should be a little grayer. Something like that. And we can copy this selected layer, go to bump map if we wanted, and add that down as well. So now we got a little bit of bump in there. This way, when we go back to our hypervoxels and we play with the shading, we can take some of the color down. We don't have to worry about it being so perfectly white and dusty. Put a little tinge of green in there. And I want to go to hypertexture, and instead of crumple, we'll use turbulence again. And we'll do an automatic size, just so we have a little bit of noise in there. And in fact, let's go back to crust. Let's see how that looks for us. Or better yet, crumple might be the good one. Automatic size on there. And let's bring it up to about 20 meters. And then for the shading, I think it's just a little too luminous. And we can bring the opacity back. We can increase the density of it. And again, bring that luminosity down. Just kind of like that. So this way, when the building settles, we got a little bit of dust. Now, I don't want that dust on there all the time. You want it just to dissipate. So the building comes down, kind of blows out. You get this cloud of dust. And right about here, about 180 or so, it needs to start fading out. So what we're going to do for that, very easily, is you can either envelope the value of the particles themselves, or you can just dissolve it out. So I'll select the emitter, and I'll press the P key to get to the properties for it. You can take this emitter, and you can go here to render, and you can go object dissolve. You can also, another way, is go back into hypervoxels from the Windows dropdown and dissolve them out. So let's do it that way, a little more appropriate. Alright, so we hit the envelope for dissolve for the emitter in the hypervoxels panel. And we know that at 180 we want a key, so we'll click right there. And how long is it going to take to dissolve out? I don't know. Let's say a few seconds or so. We'll go back to the move tool. And then we'll select this key, and we are going to make the value. Remember, this is dissolved, so 100% means it's 100% dissolved. And then we're going to do the same thing, though, so it doesn't drift. Right mouse to select these. Tension of 1, so it eases out and goes to 250. So we'll make our scene about 300 frames. And just after we get past 250, the dust just settles and goes away. Just like that. Last thing we can do is go into the surface editor and put some surfaces on this building. And I'll leave that up to you to play with the surfaces. They're all named properly. So here's a door. Here are windows. Window frame. Let's see if we can get to the glass. I'll show you how to do that. Window glass. And for this, very simply, you can add a reflection. So I'll bring the diffuse value down, the shine up a little bit, and the reflection up. And under environment, you can go ray tracing and backdrop and load the chrome that's in there. And you're not making chrome windows, but you're making a nice little blue to ground reflection. Let's put a little environment in here from the backdrop items. And then we still have our nighttime sky from our bat that we had done. So actually I don't mind that. Let's just make the ground just a little bit brighter. more sunsetty. There we go. And press 6 on our camera. Shift C to select the camera. I'll press T and I'll push it in. Okay, so there's a nice little camera shot. Now, the ground is okay. It's just some bricks. It's a little more illustrative than anything else, but what I did here is I actually set the camera to animate, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to go to this frame and hit Create Key at 0, then delete that keyframe. That way our camera stays put. So there's the procedural bricks on the ground. You can see the dust adding in. Building starts out great. Nice reflection in the windows. Comes in, animates, falls, and some nice dust in there. So very, very simple setup that should give you an idea of where you can go with putting some of these things together for particles, as well as the dynamics and using the fracture tool. Okay, it's a very simple scene, but take it a step further and what we did with the bats, putting the clouds in. Do that in this sky as well, in this environment. The next thing you can do with this, real quickly, take the lights, press the P key. We've got our distant light as a default. We can warm that up a little bit, like that. We can change the angle of it, but we can also go into global illumination and hit radiosity. And what that will do will allow the background to also be part of the scene when it's being lit. You can choose backdrop only or final gather, which are just different algorithms, but the Monte Carlo work just fine. And you can bring the intensity down a bit and just use this like a fill. It doesn't actually have to be that direct. I also like to take the light and I can make it even warmer, like that, a little more orange, and then just angle it. Get some depth in there like this. And I'm just rotating the light. I can't even see it, but I know that just rotating it is all that matters. So just something like that. You can even make this on a virtual set if you want. Take this and curve it up. And I'll save this scene. You can load this up. You can also put in a nice backdrop of an image, like I showed you earlier in the course. And let this last frame render out just to show you the building collapsing into the dust with the particles. So lots of possibilities. Let's go on and do some motion graphics using particles as well as 3D fonts.